All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, as you all know, I've covered the case of Jeffrey Epstein with very great interest from the beginning here. The story, at its core, it's not just about a monster pedophile. It's about how governments, heads of state, the media, elite class of Silicon Valley and New York City, the billionaire class, how they are all part of the same entrenched systems which allow those in power to get away with literally almost anything. It allows them to thrive, even if they're committing crimes that are some of the worst that you can commit in our society today. We got more of a peek into that world yesterday during Ghislaine Maxwell's virtual appearance in court, where she was denied bail by a federal judge on the grounds that she posed an international flight risk. She is to remain in federal custody for the next year. She will stand trial in July 2021. Now, per the date put forward by that court. So that's the top line takeaway. But it's what else we learned in the course of her multi-hour bail hearing, which I wanted to bring to all of you. Now, first of all, prosecutors gave us a bit more information about Maxwell's finances, which I fully believe are the key to decoding this entire puzzle. The government noted that Maxwell has declared 0 sources of income and yet has dozens of different bank accounts just here in the United States with balances ranging from $500,000 to $20 million. Furthermore, Maxwell is known by the government to have Swiss bank accounts with similar levels of significant funds. But what is really scary is what the government doesn't even know yet about Maxwell. Prosecutors told the court, even in her bid for release, she refused to provide any transparency about her finances whatsoever. When the government arrested Maxwell at a New Hampshire compound, they asked her, who exactly owns this compound? She would say only it was owned by a corporation, and that corporation let her live there. She didn't know who owned it. Yet the government also says that Maxwell posed as a journalist named, quote, Janet Marshall while she was touring that compound before the purchase. So clearly she's in touch with whichever corporation it is that owns this land. Who is it? We simply have no idea. One clue is that previous FBI documents say that a security guard at the New Hampshire compound was paying for former British military officers to guard her and run all of her errands for her. But there is no connection as of yet to the actual ownership of the land and Maxwell's brother. And furthermore, Maxwell's proposal for getting out of bail was literally that she would pay for herself to be holed up in a luxury hotel in downtown Manhattan until her trial date in July 2021. So the answer of where all this money is coming from, who would put it up? Which corporation exactly is this? So which and more, we have no idea about any of it. But what was even more chilling was so much of this case comes near the end of the government's presentations. It was statements from the victims themselves, who literally fear for their lives at the prospect of a monster like Ghislaine Maxwell, free from prison, with full access to her finances and the ability to wreak havoc on their lives. One victim had her statement read to the court, in which she detailed how an anonymous person called her in the middle of the night and threatened the life of her 2-year-old child as retaliation for going after Maxwell. In her statement to the court, she said, quote, the sociopathic manner in which she nurtured our relationship and abused my trust, she would have done anything to satisfy Mr. Epstein. If she is out, I need to be protected. For those of you who watched the Netflix documentary on Epstein, for all of its flaws, they did recount dozens of instances of Epstein and Maxwell deploying private investigators and detectives to allegedly harass victims who dared to cooperate with authorities. There is no evidence that we have right now that Ghislaine Maxwell is a reformed person in any way. So overall, what did we learn? Well, we learned that Maxwell's attorneys are doing everything they humanly can to avoid putting anything out there revealing about her finances for actual public scrutiny. So little of what we do know comes from the public domain and the most recent case involving Deutsche Bank. But without further litigation, there isn't much more to uncover when things were only just now really beginning to get going. But the most important thing we learned is just how much power, money, influence, and opaque support from the ruling class that Maxwell continues to have despite being a world-renowned alleged pedophile and rapist. She has access to money that will pay for her hotels. She has a corporation which lets her stay at a nice fancy house in New Hampshire, rich friends willing to put up bail money and collateral, and access to things that you or I will literally never have. And I think that was the part that really got me. is I was reading, through the transcripts, kind of like what was going on in the court and kind of following it all live. Unfortunately, we're not even able to get pictures of her in jail, right? I think that's something that the public deserves to see. But you're reading through this, and the lengths that they are going to conceal her finances is crazy. Because I think that let's think about this. She was trying to say, you need to let me out on bail. And ergo, I will be able to put up this collateral, I'll pay for my Manhattan apartment, etc. Well, to prove that to the court, you have to provide some visibility into your finances. And even then, they're like, no. So in my view, she would rather spend a year in prison waiting for trial than actually tell the court how much money she actually has, what type of access to capital she actually has. Who is this mystery corporation that owns this land? I mean, that really was the crazy part, right?
Yeah.
Is that she's like, a corporation owns it. I don't know who owns it. They let me stay there. What? I mean, this is insane.
Yeah.
And same thing with the bank account. So much of what she was saying, I was like, I believe the key to so much of this puzzle goes back to the financial interests. But that is the hardest part to get our hands on as private citizens.
As in so many things, follow the money. I mean, it's very common practice. They actually have a huge problem with this in New York City and Miami and other places of, setting up these corporations that are basically just shell companies to buy properties for these sort of like international money laundering type criminals, so that they can own these properties and it's a good place for them to park their cash. It's used in that manner all the time. So when I saw the fact that there was this sort of like shell company that bought the house,
right.
Very common tactic to try to hide the true identity of the person who actually owns the home. Clearly what she was doing here. But the idea of like, I don't know who the corporation is. Who knows? Who can say? Like, that makes zero sense whatsoever. But yeah, one of the most revealing insights that we've had so far was when Deutsche Bank was fined for recruiting Jeffrey Epstein as a client, by the way. It wasn't like he had to beg for to get in the door. They were like, let's go out and let's court Jeffrey Epstein and get his business in. And then they look the other way as he's asking, first of all, these incredibly
$1 million in cash.
Sketchy questions about like, so how much could I transfer without it triggering any federal law enforcement? Which even just asking that question
should have triggered it.
Should trigger federal law enforcement, by the way, because this is very common. It's called structuring. Right? This is something that, criminals do all the time, or people who are using their money for nefarious ends. There's all sorts of weird payments going out. They're taking money, $800,000 for supposedly tips and taxis, like all of this insanity. So they get fined for that. That seems like an important piece of the puzzle of, again, how they were able to operate with impunity for so many years. And then the piece here that you talked about with the victim, the alleged victim, saying that they threatened her 2-year-old is horrifying.
Yes.
But again, is another window into how they were able to keep this going for years and years and years.
Well, that's what also scares me, is that this is a person who was being protected by former members of the British military, clearly of access to means and of access to force and of access to scary people. So what is she going to do? I mean, it's not probably hard for her to know. I mean, she literally abused them, so she probably knows who is accusing her, specifically from the time of 1993 to 1997. That demonstrates, I think, a real fear that people out there are going to have. And it, first of all, shows how courageous these women are, even for speaking up about what happened to them, given that, if somebody here is harassing you when your 2-year-old, that's terrifying. And also, just the more you peel back, you're like, something bigger is going on here. And again, it's like with the money, where is all of this money coming from?
Right.
Ghislaine's own originating story in New York was that her father died, committed suicide maybe, or fell. Nobody knows. Her father died. He was a very rich man. But basically, she claims to have come to New York and she was broke. That's why she grafted onto Epstein in order to live the high life.
And Prince Andrew helped reintroduce her into the social
launched
scene.
her on society. And so they used that platform. Over the last 30 years, according to the government, she has not had one source of income. So where is all this millions of dollars coming from? And, some of it could have come from Epstein, but she claims she hasn't seen Epstein in a decade. She hasn't even spoken to him.
Well, and where does his money come from, by the way?
I mean, that is an even bigger macro question, which I will never, ever be able to understand. I'm sure the powers that be will quash it and hide it as much as possible. But this is a window into that, because I'm like, where did this money, property, and all this other stuff come from? and you start to put it all together. You're like, okay, why was the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak even involved with Epstein? He was pursuing business deals with Epstein. He needed his money. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say the former Prime Minister of Israel does not need to go to sketchy Jeffrey Epstein for money.
Or a business deal,
For a business deal. He could go to Goldman Sachs. He could walk into an investment bank and be like, hey, guys, I need 0% interest. I need $100 million. And they're going to write you a check because that's how it works. Why is he doing into business with him? So much of what I think is connected to all of this is like some massive financial enterprise, which, again, I think is opaque. I think is being actively covered up by Ghislaine Maxwell, is actively covered up by Deutsche Bank, actively covered up by so many of the different parties involved. And that's where the real story leads. And again, I don't know where it goes.
I think you're on to something there. Next on Rising, 1 in 3 households have not made their full housing payments for July. Professor of Economics Richard Wolff joins us to discuss what the economy might look like in the coming months when Rising returns.